So a cool thing that I did here is I set context. I set context. I manipulated the this object, and we know that the this object is a special JavaScript object that gets sort of constructed in many different ways. But one of the ways being, like, if you use the new operator on a constructor function, you create a this object in that function that gets populated with a bunch of properties and values and things of that nature. We also know that there's a you have the ability to manipulate the this object sort of implicitly, in the sense that this, when called on a method of a class, technically would be on an instance of the class, so an object method. That method, if it ever referred to this, would be referring to the calling object, which is, it's basically the variable to the left of the method name, and it's the object that called the method. For example, if I create a const object and I have name Chuck, I should probably make a multi-line comment just to illustrate this really quick. I know it's kind of hard for me to explain. So const obj, let's get that out of the way, equal to, so we're gonna have name as one of the properties, and we're gonna have, let's say hi, be a function that's console logs this dot name, right? And so if I take obj and do say hi, now this we're not really talking about like an instance of a class per se. We're just talking about JavaScript objects that can have a whole bunch of properties with a bunch of different data types. And we know in JavaScript, functions are first class citizens. You treat them essentially like variables. You can assign a variable a function, and that's perfectly fine. But anyways, so this is obviously the calling object. We're using this object to call or invoke say hi. And so any reference to this inside of say hi is bound to the calling object unless you change the context. Okay, so hang on to that. What I've done here, and I'm not 100% sure it's going to work with the function that I've sort of abstracted down below, but it works for this one. Okay, so I had all these lines of code right here, right? Fine. What we're doing here is we're essentially handling all the error cases. For example, our database schema for the user table allows you to add records of users in the database with particular properties. Properties being name, room, is active, is guest, things of that nature. Okay, makes sense. We know that the records in the database, at least from my model, you don't know this, but I know it, that the name has to be unique. What this means is that in this function, I'm going to check is name faulty. There's a couple ways a name can be faulty. Either someone's trying to be the chatbot, and remember that if you give me your name and room, I'm going to sanitize it. I'm going to trim it. There's not going to be any white space unless the white space is stuck between two different characters. Okay, fine. So we look at this function. It's referring to this. And remember, we said name has to be unique. Okay, so we're looking at this. We know that in this case, we have is not name and not room, whatever. That's not really the important part. The important part is this dot handle error cases. Okay, so what is this referring to? What are we referring to here? Well, if you take a look at our handle submit, we made sure to explicitly bind the context of this React component. Why? Because for some reason, when you do handle submit, and I guess it kind of makes sense, when you call handle submit, it's not just the method itself, because the method itself, if you were referring to handle submit sort of like normally inside any other class, you wouldn't lose context. The reason why you're losing context is because of how we're invoking handle submit. If you see, like when we go down to handle submit right here, you see we're just kind of passing it to on submit. which is another sort of React thing for us to manipulate and use. And we may not know the gist of on submit, but we know that when we give it a method in the class, somehow the this context is lost. Now we can remedy that. We don't even have to do .bind. We technically could call it like this, and here we go. We're gonna call it like that. And the reason why we can do that is because arrow functions are really weird. Arrow functions take the context of its outer lexical environment. Arrow functions are strange. And so this can work for you or against you. It definitely depends on when you're utilizing the arrow function. Okay, so we're not doing it like that though. So we're gonna specifically explicitly bind the context such that when we actually do our on submit and we're running the function, any reference to this we're making sure it's a reference to our actual class. We don't want to lose that reference. Okay. So remember, we're referencing the actual class, which means if another file or another module had access to this current component, we can then use that reference to manipulate the variables and the properties and the functions that we have in this React component, separate from this actual file. And you might be like, okay, well, I'm kind of following, but let's see. We're referencing this.state. We know that's referring to this.state with respect to this component. Okay? We know that when we extend React component, we're gonna call that parent class right there. Okay? Then we're gonna run our class. Okay, we're gonna call the constructor of the parent class. Then we're gonna run ours. Okay, so this.state. We know when we refer to this.state, we're referring to this current component. Okay, so we also know that when we use guest sign in, or not even just guest sign in, when we use any class and we refer to this, we're populating a this object inside that class. If you use the new keyword to invoke a class, any reference to this is bound to that class. All right, cool. Okay, we get it. I think that's called the new keyword binding. I don't know, something like that. So in this case, we know that this.state is bound to this object that exists within guest sign in. So what that means for us is if we can somehow give the context of guest sign in to another function or a class, we can then utilize that context to manipulate guest sign in away from the actual guest sign in file. That's what I did. I said, here, we're going to create a class for all our error handlers. We have an error handler for sign-ins. We're going to give it this. Remember, this is an object. This is an object that holds the context of guest sign in and technically React.component. We have everything we need. If we give it this, then any reference to this in our class will be referencing guest sign in and React component. So when I give this as a context to error handler for sign-ins, and I say context and I refer to this dot component context, I don't really, I'm not overhauling the this object. I'm just sort of adding, I'm just adding a property. But component context is now the equivalent of this in guest sign-in. They are this dot component context is equivalent to this in guest sign-in. So any reference to this dot component context, you can essentially say that is this in guest sign-in. And so everything that I was doing here, this dot handle error cases, I can just do, here we go, this dot handle error cases. Actually, no, we don't need to do that because, we don't need to do that because handle error cases exists in its own class. what we can do is we can say this.state.error handler, which is the name of the object, dot custom component error handler, and essentially what that's going to do is that's going to call this dot handle error cases. Now the reason why that works is because when we call this dot handle error cases, now we're using the context of the guest sign in object and using set state. Again, we have access to set state because we have access to everything that this would have normally had access to in this file. This dot component context in this file has access to. So set state, we know set state's not going to come from guest sign in. That comes from React component, and we remember that. Well, we ran React component when we called our constructor, and we called super. Right, so we know like that's going on. We don't need to get into React.component. I'm not really that deep into React yet. But that's crazy because I said, hey, I'm setting an explicit context. And I want you to manipulate the React component as if this was here. And it worked. It worked like a charm. Handle error sign in. I think I might have accidentally messed something up when I was just messing around with the code, but it should work unless I might have booped something without even knowing. Let's see, what did I change here? Because I was just adding a bunch of shit. Hopefully I didn't really mess it up. There you go. Works like a charm. And if we go chuck, there you go. Isn't that crazy? Isn't that's actually insane? And so what I can actually do is, this is gone. I don't need this anymore. Yeah, no, this is gone. There's absolutely no need for it. And the reason why I did that, I had to abstract it so intensely, is because I want to be able to, one, make this a little bit cleaner. And you can actually see here, I don't know if I still have it open, but you could have saw the context that I was talking about. Here we go. Component context. Here we go. And we know we called super, so we added React.component to the prototype chain. Yeah, and we have render, and we just keep going at React component. Yeah. Set state. See, there you go. So, and this all comes back down to the prototypal inheritance of JavaScript, that sort of nature-y thing, but we don't need to get into that. But yeah, isn't that sick? That's fucking sick.